Hi, Ms. Lou, are you able to see and hear me and see the PowerPoints? Excellent. Appreciate your being here. Appreciate those of you that will be looking at this later or reading the notes that are posted in doc sharing, which basically is what we're going to talk about here. And going to have a little bit different procedure today. We need to do 2 classes. I've got to travel next week, and I won't be here on Wednesday. So when we get through with this class, I'm going to step out for a second and then come back and step in again and do the class that really would have been scheduled for next Wednesday at this time. Okay, so if you look in the archives, you'll notice that there'll be a class that says 563 for September 20, and you're thinking, well, it's not September 20 yet, right? Well, that's the reason why. The label perhaps is misleading. But I'm going to do a second class after the first one today that basically covers material that will be covered next week. And I realize lots of you can't sit in this for 2 hours, and hopefully it won't run quite that long. But they'll be recorded. They'll be there. The notes are already posted in doc sharing, and you know, even though I'm going to be traveling, I'll still be answering emails pretty well normally and taking phone calls. And you know, don't hesitate to call or email with questions. The following week, the 27th, is going to be our first test. So, you know, be sure that you do look at the notes for next week and really notes for every week, and look at your homework carefully, and that you're aware we got a test coming up on those dates. In any event, welcome to Accounting 563 for September 13. Today we're going to talk about financial statement fraud, and this is really important. Okay, it's a going concern issue. If a large publicly held corporation has to restate its earnings, then typically the stock price goes to the floor. They can't raise capital. They're pretty well out of business. You're certainly going to see a lot of people at the top getting fired. So, you know, certainly it's a going concern issue for top managers. And yeah, it could be a going concern issue for shareholders too, who might wind up losing the money that they've invested in their stock because the corporation gets a liquidity problem. But because it had to restate its financial statements and nobody wanted to loan them money or let them buy stuff on credit. So this is really, you know, this really is kind of why we're here. It relates back to the expectations gap, and then we'll make several references to the expectations gap today, and why. In a large publicly held corporation, I'm sure smaller ones too, but in a large publicly held corporation, you know, managers, top managers, you know, really do, you know, they want the corporation to do well and they want to fight fraud. In any event, the reason we're so focused on this is it is kind of how we got to be here. Distinguish the roles of directors, officers, internal auditors, external auditors, and forensic auditors. I know we've talked about this before, but it's pervasive to the material, and it's so likely. The more we talk about something, the more redundant I get talking about something. Obviously, the more likely it is it's going to show up on the test. Okay, directors are part-timers. Okay, they're ultimately, they're representing the interest of the shareholders. They're elected by the shareholders, but they're part-timers. Okay, they have oversight responsibilities. They don't actually do anything. Okay, that's kind of tacky, but they have oversight. They're really responsible for everything. They're the really the stockholders, the owners are the ultimate authority, but they elect the directors, and the directors hire and fire the officers, and the officers really run the show in the day-to-day sense, but the directors have oversight responsibilities. Basically, the directors determine what the risk tolerance of the company is, what that risk-reward balance ought to be. Right, and they make the strategic long-term decisions, okay, and then they hire managers to achieve the objectives at the risk levels that they find acceptable, Okay, and directors are really very important, and yes, we do frequently mention directors, but probably don't talk about them enough. But understand here that they're not really hands-on. They have oversight of operations. They'll meet maybe once a quarter and listen to a lot of information provided to them by managers, and sometimes tend to be dominated by managers and not as skeptical as perhaps as they should be. They'll also hear information directly, not filtered through management, but directly from internal auditors and external auditors. Okay, so, you know, but primarily, like everybody in a big business, they're dependent on managers for information. Okay, and the objectives of the director would be to set the risk tolerance. Okay, the balance between risk and reward that managers are expected to take, okay, and then provide oversight of operations without actually doing anything. Managers actually execute operations. Now, this is the reason why managers are so powerful in corporations. They've got the information. Okay, they're actually running things. Okay, directors are at a disadvantage. There's information asymmetry between managers and directors, and to some extent, we're trying to cut down on this, but to some extent, you know, directors hear what managers want them to know. Okay, you know, that's one reason why auditors, internal and external, you know, are supposed to be so skeptical of managers, because you are ultimately getting your information from managers, or you're auditing the representations that have been made by managers, and you know, managers actually do the work. Okay? Now, part of that, and I'll come back to this again, and come back to it repeatedly, is that part of the work that managers do is that they design and execute internal controls. We've talked about this term before. We'll talk about it again today, right? Policies and procedures implemented by managers to provide reasonable assurance that corporate operations are effective and efficient, and corporations complying with law, and of course for accountants, most importantly, the information is reliable. Okay, and it's management's responsibility to design and implement internal controls, as well as to do everything else. They're chief cook and bottle washer. They do everything. Okay, so then you have internal and external auditors. Basically, they don't do anything either. They're kind of like directors, right? Managers do all the work. Internal and external auditors can't do any work, because you can't audit your own work, and their purpose in life is to be an auditor. They provide assurance services and they provide consulting services. Okay, we want to be clear that we make a distinction between those two types of services. Okay, with assurance services, right, there are three parties involved. Okay, it's the auditee and the auditor, and then there's the third party that's receiving an opinion of some sort. You know, what you're most familiar with is the opinion on the compliance with GAAP. Okay? And then you also have consulting services that auditors also provide, both internal and external auditors. Okay, there's only two parties to the relationship. You're doing training, you're providing advice, you're coordinating, you're managing, you're not issuing an opinion on anything. Okay. Internal and external auditors are different. We'll talk about that different later. But basically, understand that internal auditors tend to be, they could be contracted out, but it tends to be employees of the company, whereas external auditors is an independent contractor relationship. They ideally, again, the idea that they can do consulting services is contrary to this, but ideally, the external auditor issuing an opinion on the financial statements would be completely, totally independent, not have any relationship with the auditee other than the audit contract that spells out the duties of the audit and what he's going to get paid for it. Okay? When you do consulting work, To me, that muddies the water on independence, but whatever. We'll talk about that later, and it's time for another thing. Make sure you know the difference between internal and external auditors. Make sure you know the difference between assurance services and consulting services. Remember, assurance services have 3 parties, and usually results in some kind of opinion being expressed, whereas a consulting service, there's only 2 parties involved, and it doesn't necessarily require reporting anything to any third parties. Forensic auditors are different. Their objective in life is to resolve disputed facts. Okay, they're like the fire truck that comes out. You know, you normally don't have a forensic auditor on the scene, okay, unless it's crime scene. They resolve disputed facts. If there's some uncertainty involved, there's a dispute about facts, or just uncertainty about what the facts are, which typically is the case when a crime is committed, like fraud, then the forensic auditor resolves disputed facts. Okay, it doesn't have anything to do with compliance with GAAP or efficient and effective operations, or I guess to say that legal compliance, because has the law been broken? It's a different focus than internal and external auditors have. I told you I think this is the most important document in the whole class. I probably said that about 12 times. SAS 99 creates a duty for external auditors, right? It's the ACCT that issues this. So we're talking about CPAs and assurance services that an external auditor provides. And it created a duty for external auditors doing GAAP compliance audits to consider fraud, the possibility of fraud in audit planning and execution, identify red flags of fraud, and report red flags to the proper level of management or to directors. I think we said this before. Skepticism is definitely required. And for internal auditors, basically got the same set of obligations. It's under IIA standards, Institute of Internal Auditors. It's not the AICPA, it'd be the IIA, but the same duty applies there. That there is a duty to consider fraud in planning an audit and executing the audit, to be able to identify red flags of fraud and to report them to the proper level of management or to directors, and then go back to work on your original audits. Right? If you're an auditor, the reason you saw that red flag was you were doing some kind of audit, right? You've got an audit contract, either between the internal audit department and the other department being audited, or between the external auditor and the entity being audited. You need to get back to that contract and take care of business. Clock's running. Okay, you got both a money clock and a time clock running, in the sense that opinions needed in a certain time frame, and you're only getting paid a certain amount to do it. Okay, and certainly even if you're getting paid by the hour, clients not going to want to pay for a lot of hours that aren't directly related to the audit. And a lot of red flags, most red flags are false positives, and even if it is positive, it doesn't necessarily mean the amount's material, or that even if it's a financial issue involved that's going to affect the financial statements, okay? So if you're the external auditor or the internal auditor, you want to comply with SAS 99 and you want to get back to your business, okay? With the idea that now that you've notified them, you may get a little extra business. They may authorize some additional hours, okay? That may be a good thing, but in any event, okay, do a little bit of an investigation to determine, confirm it really is not it's a red flag, but it's false positive, it's okay. If you can do that with a little bit of investigation, and that's fine, then go on, get on about your business. Okay, if you can't, then notify, before you put too many hours into it, notify management and let them decide what to do about it. Certainly when you do that, you document it, and you document what their response is. Because the key thing you're worried about, probably what determines whether you want to notify managers or not, is if something does go wrong later, are you going to get blamed? And do you feel the need to immunize yourself by documenting your having given notice to management and management's response? Okay? And again, next slide talks a little more detail about red flags, and I probably said most of it already. But most red flags are not positive, okay? And you don't want to spend too much time looking at them. And sometimes it's just easier to report them than it is to investigate them. But if it's relevant to the assurance or consulting engagement, okay, if it appears that it is material amount and you know it affects the purpose of the audit, it affects compliance with GAAP, well then that's part of your original job, and you do it. You don't necessarily talk to management first. Right? If it's a really bad fraud, you might not want to tip them off. Okay, but if it's clear, you know that it's related, it's relevant to your original job, what you're doing there, that caused you to see the red flag to begin with, well then, yeah, investigate it. You don't need to say anything to management. Okay. Otherwise, report the red flag and then get on back to work. Okay. Assuming it's not material to the original engagement, then investigate it only to the extent needed to confirm a false positive. And if you can't do that quick and cheap, just report it and protect yourself and go on and let management decide what they want to do about it. Document any red flags that you report and document what the response of management was. And the idea is, you know, you're determining whether or not managers accept the risk. If they don't want to spend the money on the forensic audit, then fine, they made their choice. Like the management, they get to do that. Okay. Now, if they do authorize a fraud investigation, okay, here's a twist you need to think about. Okay, rather than having the accountant, the forensic auditor, you know, do it, you hire management will want to hire a lawyer and let the lawyer hire the forensic accountant. Okay, then the forensic accountant is serving as a consultant to the lawyer in investigating the red flag. And any communications, any corporate information that passes back and forth between the fraud examiner, fraud auditor, and the attorney, okay, will arguably privileged information and not likely to be revealed to outsiders. Okay? So a lot of times early on, you know, even before the investigation begins, okay, management might want to take a sort of an indirect route to hiring the fraud examiner or authorizing the additional hours, right, is by putting an attorney in there as an interface, and then having the fraud examiner communicate exclusively with the attorney. Okay, and the communications between the attorney and the forensic examiner, okay, be privileged under attorney work product, right? And the client here is the corporation, and the fraud examiner is a consultant to the attorney. Okay, and so if you are a fraud examiner and you're receiving an assignment directly from management, you know, your first question might be, you know, gee, do we expect litigation? And if we do, why don't we run this through an attorney so that we can benefit from that? And when don't you expect litigation, right? So this probably ought to be a pretty routine thing. Fraud's an intentional act. It means it's hard to prove. Hard to prove fraud. Okay, fraud means you intended to do something, and nobody knows what anybody intended to do. It's a purely subjective thing. It's between your ears. Nobody else really knows what you intend to do. All that anybody can do is to consider your outward actions and infer from that, in the context of your actions and the actions that you took, what your intent might be. And it's a purely circumstantial case only. If there's any rational interpretation of the facts, okay, that supports not being guilty or not being liable, then the judge is going to instruct the jury that that's the way they got to go. So it's hard to prove fraud. Okay, That's okay. If you can't prove fraud, you got misrepresentation. You fall back on that. It's basically the same thing. You recover your loss, but you're not going to get punitive damages, right? And usually from the person that committed the fraud, you're not going to get damages anyway because they're judgment proof. For SEC cases, scienter is a word you ought to have in your vocabulary, right? Since the SEC cases, it's just going to be publicly held corporations. For an action that's taken under the SEC Acts, Rule 10b-5 or SEC Act of 1934, instead of intent, all you have to prove is that you made the statement knowing that it was false. You know, that you had knowledge of its falsity. Okay, that's enough to get you over the intent issue, to make it easier for plaintiffs to bring their lawsuits against fraudsters to recover civil damages. Okay, scienter, just a fancy word for fraud. It's a watered down version of fraud. Okay, instead of actually intending to deceive, which is what the intent means in this context, okay, we're substituting just a knowledge that the statement was false. Okay, that you know, and sometimes you say things that are false and you're mistaken too, right? That it just wasn't a mistake. So, and that makes a big difference when you're bringing your suit, because this is hard to prove intent. That's just, you know, if there's any, there's a circumstantial evidence instruction that the judge is going to give the jury, telling them that if there is any plausible, rational, okay, not the best, not the most persuasive or convincing, but just any explanation that's consistent with innocence, you got to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. Okay, and if the jury follows that instruction, and the defendant can come up with just, you know, any, you know, fig leaf of a rationale, you got to give him the game. He wins. Okay, and so scienter is harder to prove. I mean, sorry, easier to prove than intent would be. Oh my gosh, we're going to sound like an auditing class here. If you've already had auditing, I'm going to be telling you stuff you already know. If you hadn't had auditing yet, then when you get there, you'll hopefully remember you heard it here first. Distinguish test of controls from test of transactions and balances. Okay, there's auditing, there's a two-step process. First step is the auditor examines the internal controls and whether the internal controls are being complied with. Okay, you might take a little bit of a sample here, and what you're interested in is determining to the extent to which the auditor can rely on the internal control system. If you have an effective internal control system on paper, and the people that work there are actually following their instructions, well, then you can take a smaller sample. You can rely on the internal control system, and you probably feel comfortable taking a smaller sample. On the other hand, if the internal control systems itself has problems, or the people aren't following instructions, they're not executing the internal control system, and you can't rely on the internal control system, then you need a larger sample. Right? This is a big deal, because when you're doing auditing for a large publicly held corporation, you're using sampling. Okay, and the size of the sample that you're required to take is going to determine the number of hours of field work that you're going to need. It's going to drive up the cost of that audit, and it's also going to drive up the time that it takes to do an audit. And basically, if the auditor determines that they can't rely on the internal controls, you can't do one. You can't do it in a timely manner or a cost-efficient manner. Okay, and probably at that point the auditor's going to back out and go, you know, I got to do a disclaimer. I don't know. Okay, and nobody's going to be happy with that. And really, there's kind of a balance here. And really, what the balance boils down to is how much time you got, and how much money has your client got, and how many hours are they willing to pay for. And at some point, a sample size gets so big that you can't do it within the financial or the time constraints. Okay. And certainly auditors, like everybody else, they're trying to do their work in an effective and efficient manner. And the idea is, how big a sample size do I need? And, don't want to get one any bigger than that. Okay, test of controls determine the sample size. Sample size is determined in part, okay, by the extent to which the auditor can rely on the internal controls. Now that you've decided what your sample size is going to be, then you do your test of transactions and accounts, where you're actually, taking samples and recording the evidence that's going to support the expression of an audit opinion. Okay, two-step process. In your business law class, if you've had that, and again, if you hadn't, when you get there, you've heard it here first. The Sarbanes-Oxley requirements for certificates, where top managers have to sign certificates that they personally understand the internal control system, and that they personally believe that the internal control system reasonably assures reliable information. Likewise, another separate opinion as to compliance with GAAP, that they personally understand GAAP, and they personally understand the financial statements, and they think they comply with GAAP. Okay? And the two statements relates back to the distinction between test of controls and test of transactions. And of course, again, those two statements are another big reason why we're in this classroom today, is because when they started putting the fear of the Lord in top managers of publicly held corporations, it created tons and tons of jobs for internal auditors and for forensic accountants. Peekaboo. I don't know whether to get peekaboo out of this. The lawyers really don't line up for that, and I take it that the people that work at peekaboo don't like that name. But whatever. It's the Public Company Accountants. Oh gosh, something Observation Accountability Board, something like that. It's a federal agency. It's a subset of the SEC. It's an amendment to the SEC Act of 1934. That sets up this government agency called the PCAOB. Okay, and the idea, and this is a reaction to some corporate frauds back in the 90s and the early 2000s, and the scary thing was that peekaboo has the power to define auditing standards. Okay, and everybody got all upset about that because Congress expressly stated in the statute that they had the power to do that. And it just scared the willies out of everybody because they thought the government was fixing to come in and start telling us how to do audits. And right now, auditing standards, GAAS, are codified by the ACCT, right, a nonprofit organization that doesn't have anything to do with the government. It's a private organization. Similar generally accepted accounting principles are codified by the Financial Accounting Standards Board, which is a non-profit organization. It's not the government. Okay, but under the 34 Act, the federal government, the SEC, could define GAAP, just like they can define GAAS. Okay. But yeah, none of that's happened. The reason that the statements of the Financial Accounting Standards Board have authority is because the SEC has designated the Financial Accounting Standards Board, right, as the source of GAAP. In years past, they've designated other organizations and bodies. Okay, and you understand that it's not that the federal government doesn't have the power to do this; they do, but they don't. They exercise admirable restraint, and they let private organizations do it. And this is true both for GAAP and for GAAS. Peekaboo designates the AICPA as the official source for auditing standards. Okay. The AICPA follows a COSO model. Okay, and this is going to be the most bureaucratic sounding title you've ever heard. Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. Sponsored what? Well, what they did was they sponsored something called the Treadway Commission. Okay, there have been some financial statement frauds, and this was back in the 80s. Okay, about every 20 years we get a wave of these things. And in response to those financial statement frauds, they started setting up some rules and standards for publicly held corporations to follow in terms of internal controls. Okay, and the other thing you see on the slide is the COSO definition of internal controls, right? And COSO Peekaboo designates the ACCT to codify accounting standards. That's why the SASs are so important, and the ACCT pretty well follows this COSO model. And they define internal controls as policies and procedures executed by managers. Okay, I can't say that too many times. It's management's job to design and implement internal controls. Auditors audit internal controls, right? You can't audit your own work. So we talk about internal controls so much in auditing classes that if you're not quite paying attention, it just sort of makes sense that it's got something to do with internal auditors or external auditors, because they're spending so much time looking at them. They're looking at somebody else's work and at somebody else's managers. All right. So policies and procedures executed by managers to provide reasonable assurance of reliable information, effective and efficient compliance, and legal compliance. Okay, those three are typically called the internal control objectives. Okay, these are the things that a corporation, that an internal auditor or an external auditor is providing assurance of. Assurance that GAAP is getting complied with. In the case of an internal auditor, assurance that operations are effective and efficient, and assurance that we're in compliance with the law, that we're not violating the law. Okay, and again, this is management's responsibility. Management's responsibility. Auditors provide assurances that relate to internal controls and whether management's doing their job or not, right? And directors oversee what they're doing, but it's the managers. And really, we talk about managers like they're bad people sometimes. We keep emphasizing we're skeptical of them and things like that. Yeah, basically managers are people to get the work done. All right, to get the railroads built, they get the product delivered, the services performed, you know, they get us paid. And accountants and auditors, yeah, it's overhead. Right, so, you know, let's give managers their due, but with that due comes a bunch of responsibility. Objectivity. Okay, for an accountant or an auditor, right, I'm including accountants here too, to do their job, they've got to be objective. They've got to make professional decisions, okay, and not be overly influenced by management. They got to have their own view of reality. They can't believe something's true just because somebody told them so. And when it comes time to apply GAAP, okay, they've got an obligation to follow GAAP. That an accountant in designing an accounting system is basically designing a system to collect the information that's needed in order to present the information in a manner that it complies with GAAP. And managers don't tell accountants what account titles to debit and credit. Right? The accountant makes that decision, right, based on the facts of the case and the applications of GAAP. Likewise, when the auditor comes in and audits the financial statements, right, they make an objective, independent judgment, and they just don't believe it because management says so. Okay, for assurance services, like compliance with GAAP. Okay, objectivity is just absolutely required. CPAs, external auditors, are independent. In theory, ideally at least, the only relationship between the auditee and the auditor, the external auditor, would be the audit contract. Right? If the external auditor is also doing a lot of consulting and tax work, and that kind of waters down the objectivity, the independence a little bit. You know, you make the client angry and they fire you, and you lose the audit work. You're probably going to lose the tax work, consulting work too, right? You hate to you know, sometimes you do need to be willing to be fired and walk away from the table, but that really ups the ante on what you're walking away from. CIA's internal auditors, okay, they're typically employees. They're not independent. There's something called institutionally independent. Okay? Boy, you know, that's like jumbo shrimp. There ain't no such thing, okay? Institutionally independent. And as a practical matter, what this means is that the internal auditors report administratively to managers, but functionally to board of directors. Okay, so they have a direct line of communication to the board of directors, okay, and they work for management, right? You know, they're administratively they report to management. Management cuts their checks, but the internal auditors hire them and fire them and negotiate their contracts, and the reports of the internal audit department go to the board of directors. They are institutionally independent. Okay, they report administratively to managers, but functionally, in terms of expressing assurances, that goes directly to directors. And then they have a direct line of communication with directors that management is not a party to. They get to talk to the directors when the managers are not in the room, and that gives them a little more objectivity. Also, they get hired and fired by the board of directors. The board of directors sets their salaries. Managers pay them, but managers pay them whatever board of directors say. Okay. And again, the whole idea about objectivity is you can't audit your own work. Okay. If you get the chance, there's an internal auditing class that's offered, and gosh, probably half of that class you spend time talking about consulting services that you can and cannot provide without impairing your objectivity. Okay, and both internal auditors and external auditors also provide consulting services as well as assurance services for external auditors. Frequently, this includes tax services or management advisory services. Okay, and for CIAs and internal auditors, typically this includes all manner of consulting services, not tax, okay, but other kind of consulting services, generally related to the effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and oftentimes non-financial measures that are much broader in scope than what a CPA does. And that's one reason why lots of CPAs or CIAs would prefer to do consulting work. It's a much more collaborative relationship with management. You're a lot closer to being a player. And yeah, the problem is you're actually doing work, and if you've consulted with somebody on something, then you can't turn around and audit them on how well they're doing. Okay? Basically, if you're a CIA and you're doing consulting work for a division, well then, yeah, you need to sit out a year on going and doing some kind of assurance services that relate to that division. Internal controls have limits. Okay, nothing's perfect in this world. Okay, managers can override internal controls. I don't care what the rule book says. Okay, if the top manager comes down and tells a lower level manager or a lower level employee to do something, they're likely to do it. Okay, they're going to be personally dominated by the individual, and so you've got management overrides. You might have collusion. Okay? Most of your internal controls are based on segregation of duties. Again, it would be helpful if you had an auditing class, and if not, when you get there, right, segregation of duties means that any particular transaction can be broken down into 3 component parts: authorization, and custody of assets, and recording of the use of assets. Basically, authorization to use the assets, the person that's actually using them, and then the person that keeps the records. And as long as you got 3 people that are not buddies, that aren't willing to cover for each other, and then, yeah, segregation of duties solves a host of ills, right? If employees know that they're there, they're likely to be deterred, and and if they're not deterred and you've got segregation of duties and it's effective, they'll be detected pretty quickly. Okay, collusion is the word you have in your vocabulary, right? That relates to a specific form of cooperation, right? And to individuals that have incompatible duties, right? And the incompatible duties are authorization and custody and record keeping. You can just have concealment. People forge documents, they tell lies, they do things that create the appearance of truth. And people just make mistakes. They lose things, you know, they transpose numbers, they put things in the wrong account. Yeah, you know, no human endeavor is perfect. Okay? But the big things that you're looking for right then is management overrides. And there ought to be skepticism. If you're an accountant or an auditor and manager asks you to do something that's out of the ordinary, yeah, you always say, be happy to. Please send me an email so you tell me exactly what I want you to do. All right, and I'd be happy to do it. And if there's anything that's slippery, yeah, then they're not going to send you that email and problem solved. And if they do send you that email, then you just forward it on up to the board of directors and let the board tell you what to do. Right? And even if you make the journal entry, yeah, you immediately, if you do make the journal entry for sure, you immediately send notice to the board of directors. And the ideal thing is, yeah, you don't make the journal entry. Okay, you know, if the guy's dumb enough to send you an email asking you to do something improper, you don't do it. You forward that email to the board of directors. And by asking for the email, yeah, you're showing you're not somebody to be trifled with, and they'll go find some other stooge to be the scapegoat. Okay, there are some inherent limits on audits. Okay, first of all, the use of sampling. Okay, you know, statisticians believe it, and they say it's true. Yeah, you know, anything that's so complex that you can't understand, you know, how the sausage was made, then yeah, don't trust the sausage. I'm skeptical about statistics, and you can say a lot of things with statistics. Okay, and the key thing about statistics is that it is so complex, and there are so many discrete decisions to be made that you could just about always, in a complex assignment, find expert witnesses on both sides who are both perfectly qualified and credible and reach perfectly different conclusions on the appropriate statistical test to be used, or the correct sample size, or how to choose a sample, or how to interpret the results. And yeah, the more complex things are, the more hooks there are for people to reasonably disagree. And boy, statistics is probably about as complex as you get, right? Basically, if you can make a fig leaf of a case for some kind of sampling error or error related to statistical things, you're going to get in front of a jury, and the jury's not going to understand a word they say, and they're going to vote for whoever they like best. You know, it's a slot machine, it's a casino, it's why it's fun, and it's why auditors suffering from the expectations gap really don't want to go there. Okay, there's a shortage of time. Typically, you got like 60, 90 days to do an audit on a billion-dollar corporation with thousands of employees and you know, warehouses and plants and locations scattered all over the world. You haven't got a whole lot of time. Right, and there's some things you can do before the end of the accounting period, right? But most field work has to be done after the end of the accounting period, so it's got to be done quickly. There's some cost-benefit constraints, and this is kind of a pervasive constraint for all human activity. Is, you know, what's the cost involved? Right? If the resources are not available, or if the cost of the information is so great, it's worth more than the information itself is, you ain't going to do it. And again, just like for the internal control systems, there's human error. People, you know, they're human. They do things wrong sometimes. Also, notice the language that's used in assurance services, right? Assurance. Nobody said guarantee. Right, them weasel words, right? What does assurance mean? It does not mean guarantee, and reliable does not mean accurate. And I think that dinged a few people on homework last time. That's one reason I made sure to put that little phrase in the notes here. Okay, reliable means that you can rely on it to make a decision. Nobody ever said, or could reasonably say, that the numbers and account balances that are reported on financial statements are accurate, right? Most of them have got some element of estimation built in them somewhere, right? You know, when you look at at some numbers, they're facts, right? The historical cost of an asset, no problem. You go find yourself a source document and just got it down to the dollar and the penny, not as precise as you can get. But the book value of the asset depended on the depreciation method you used, and the assumptions or estimates you made about salvage values and number of periods, and yeah, it's a funny baloney number, right? The many account balances are deceptively precise, right? When you look at a set of financial statements, every account balance has got a particular number on it, right? And some of them are particular, they got source documents, right? And some of them are based on management's estimates. And of course, the perverse thing about it is that the ones based on management estimates are probably closer to market value than the book value would have been, because book value is historical and quickly becomes irrelevant. Okay, but yeah, and there are inherent limits on internal controls, and there's inherent limits on audits. Okay, so again, no guarantees. That's what makes audit work kind of scary for the auditor, right? There could be something there, and I didn't see it. And it's why the expectations gap is such a big deal, right? Because assurance is not a guarantee, and lots of jurors kind of have preconceived notions it does. And again, reliable didn't mean accurate, right? Lots of numbers on financial statements are estimates, right? And maybe if you read the footnotes or something, you might get some kind of range, but generally not. Okay, book value, you probably find a footnote telling you maybe the assumptions that you made, right? And that kind of tips you off that it's an estimate. Anyway, any inherent limits of auditing, of internal controls, and also of audits. Oh boy. Analytical reviews, ratio analysis, percentage analysis, and statistical analysis. And the one in particular you ought to know by name is Benford's Law. Okay, somehow they came up with the idea that if you look at the first couple of digits of the numbers that are used in journal entries, that you're not going to get a normal distribution. And when people start making up stuff, they tend to follow normal distributions. All right, so you can apply Benford's Law to look at the numbers that are used in journal entries, and if it follows a normal distribution, that's a red flag. But if it follows a Benford distribution, yeah, that's pretty much what you expected to see. Okay, analytical reviews, ratio analysis, percentage analysis. This would be something you had in Accounting 525. Basically, the idea is that analytical reviews show relationships between account balances and trends in account balances, and if you see something that's unexpected, if you see your sales and accounts receivables going up, but you don't see your cash flow going up, that's a red flag. You need to look into it and find out what's the explanation for the inconsistency. Okay, percentage analysis, likewise, when you see your cost of goods sold percentage going up from one year to the next, you're wondering why. Maybe it's got something to do with all the inventory that's being stolen and counted as part of cost of goods sold. Okay, all of these things help generate red flags. Here's the interesting stuff. Corporations can be criminally liable for crimes, right? They can receive fines. You can't put them in jail, right? You put an individual in jail. We'll talk about that too. Okay, but corporations can commit crimes and can be punished for that. Okay, now one kind of punishment you get is a fine. It's a monetary fine. There's not much else you can do to a corporation other than kill it. Death penalty. And the death penalty would be administered by the state in which the corporation was formed. for example, Arthur Anderson was a limited partnership, but same thing, corporation, limited partnership, some kind of limited liability entity. It was organized under the laws of the state of Illinois. And when Arthur Anderson picked up a felony conviction, the firm picked up a felony conviction for spoliation, right, following the discovery of the Enron scandal. State of Illinois revoked their limited liability partnership charter, right? And that was the end of the company, right there. Okay. Corporations can be held liable for crimes, and the two ways that they can be punished would be that the state government that issued their corporate charter could revoke the charter, and conviction of a felony is typically grounds for doing that. Okay, and of course the court that convicted them can impose a fine. Usually what they do is they impose a significant fine and then a suspended sentence of 2, maybe 3 years, with the idea that during that suspension period, the corporation is going to implement a fraud prevention program. And if they come back at the end of the suspension period and they've got this program in place, then the judge waives up to 95% of the fine. So they only pay 5%. Right? Of course, in the meantime, good news, they hired a bunch of fraud examiners, right, to set up a fraud prevention department. And it creates jobs for internal auditors and fraud examiners. And most large publicly held corporations, they anticipate the problem coming. They've already got these things set up to keep from getting into the situation, and then also to demonstrate to the court that when a corporate agent does commit a crime, that it's an aberrant, it's a loose cannon. Normally corporations are not criminally liable for the acts of their agents. Okay, it's not enough that a corporate agent commits a crime for the corporation itself to be liable. In addition to the corporate agent committing the crime, there also has to be some proof of a lack of supervision or condonement or encouragement or some level of corporate involvement in the crime. And again, this is kind of fuzzy, maybe just being vaguely aware of it and accepting the benefits of it. Probably not enough, but you can see the direction we're moving, as opposed to having actual knowledge of it. Okay, not just knowledge of facts and circumstances suggestive, but something more specific than that, or even directing the guy to do it. Okay, which would then cause the corporation to certainly become liable. Okay, but if the corporation is liable, typically what happens is they get a fine, a suspended sentence. They don't pay the fine until the end of the suspended sentence, and then when they do, they get a 95% discount because in the meantime they set up a fraud prevention department. Now, if you're an individual and you get convicted of some kind of financial statement fraud, you're going to get jail time. Not a lot. Okay, you can see the numbers and the number of months and things in the books. You're talking about a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years. And you occasionally see people like Bernie Eber's got 20-something. You get exceptions, but generally you're talking about 4 or 5 years or less. And they count time funny in prisons, and it usually works to the prisoner's benefit. And yeah, you get a couple of years in the federal pen. You go there and you keep your nose clean. You're gonna be out in a little more than a year. Hardly anybody gets out any quicker than that because it just takes that long for the bureaucracy to move. But yes, you're going to do some jail time. It's the mandatory sentences that judges don't have discretion over for individuals that are involved in financial statement fraud. Remember, as the accountant, they're going to make you a scapegoat if you let them. That's why when they ask you to do something improper, you ask to see the email, and you'd be happy to do anything they say as long as they put it in an email, and hopefully that wards off problems. But if you do something improper, keep in mind that accountants make the world's best scapegoats. Right? They don't get a lot of sympathy out of juries. Nobody really understands what accountants do anyway. And Accountants make great scapegoats because they're in a position to know what's going on, and they're the people that actually make the journal entries, right? So always protect yourself. Ask for that email, whether you're an auditor or an accountant. Be objective, be skeptical. Okay, don't do things that are not consistent with your own version of the facts in the application of GAAP. Clawbacks. Okay, this is kind of harsh. If you're a manager and you're receiving a bonus, which most managers do, and that bonus is based on the performance of the corporation, the corporation's financial statements, which sometimes they are, okay? Or they're based on something that's influenced by the financial statements, the stock price or something like that, okay? And you get a bonus. You really don't know it's yours for 3 years. Because if it turns out that the financial statements have to be misstated, then the corporation is required to take steps to claw back that bonus and to report to the IRS on the steps that it took in the results. Now, it's a really rare thing for this to happen. But, you know, there's a little cloud on the horizon that anytime a corporate manager gets a bonus, right, and they probably don't want to go build a swimming pool or something with it because they might have to refund the money in the event that there is a restatement in the next 3 years. Well, this is sort of a disincentive for financial statement frauds too, because it's not like you get the money and then you quit. You got to work somewhere else, right? And you don't care whether the company falls or not. You still got a little money in the game. Interviews. Lots of interview questions on the CFE exam. Okay, spend a lot of time looking at the material in the book where they talk about interviews. Basic idea about an interview is that they show some pictures of how to arrange furniture, right? You always want to have an unobstructed view of the subject. Okay, you want to have them in a room where you've got privacy because you don't want to be overheard. You don't want to have any accusations that you made, you said something libelous or slanderous that was overheard by a third party. So you want privacy. You really don't want anybody there except the subject of the interview. Okay, you might want a second person there to take notes for you or something like that, or just to have 2-on-1 in the room in case a fight breaks out. Right? But you don't want the interview to be conducted in front of somebody else. Now, one exception to this is in some union situations, the employee has a right to a union representative to be present during the interview. They don't get to participate. Right? It's not like you got a lawyer or something. But they observe, right? And they get to take notes too. But normally you don't want to interview people in groups. You want to interview a person one at a time. Okay. Typically, you want to have an unobstructed view so that during the course of the interview, you can start off by asking really softball questions, okay, because you want to observe the person while they're relaxed. And that's a relative term, right? You're doing an interview with internal auditors. You're not relaxed. It's a work situation. It's not particularly relaxing, but try to make it as relaxing as you can, because you want to observe the person's physical characteristics when they're not stressed. Because, as you conduct the interview, you're going to start out with real softball questions, very general questions, and very non-controversial questions. And then you're going to transition towards questions that are more specific, more uncomfortable, and you want to observe changes in their behavior. Poker players call it a tell. Like that you can tell when somebody's lying by observing their physical characteristics. They start pulling on their hair, or rubbing their nose, or they're twitching their hands or their wrists or their ankles. That's why you want a full view, because the tell might be what they do with their legs. You know, did they cross their legs different? Did they suddenly start moving their legs where they were still? Or were they jumpy before and now they're getting real calm? Ask simple questions going from the general to specific. Be nice. Okay? Ideally, this is all being recorded. It's all being videotaped, right? Later, the defense attorney's going to look at that tape. The jury might be looking at that tape. Judge might be looking at that tape. You want to make sure you come across as a nice guy, right? You're on camera. Smile. Okay? Don't be abusive. Don't try to lead them in any particular direction. You know, do a real Sergeant Joe Friday on it. You just facts. Just want to know what facts are. Ask them for help. At the beginning of the interview, you know, introduce yourself. Tell them, you know, give them some general description of what you're trying to do, and ask for their help. Tell them you're trying to resolve some facts, and can you help me? And then at the end of the interview, always thank you for helping me. Okay? Ask simple questions. Go from the general to the specific. Okay? Never ever touch. Don't touch. And don't have a lock on the door. Okay? If the guy wants to leave, good deal. Back off. Don't get between him and the door. Be nice. Hold it open for him. Let's go. Okay? Or don't have to be nice like that. Yeah, if the guy wants to leave, if the suspect wants to leave, yeah, they're free to leave. You have absolutely no authority to restrain or restrict them in any way. And if you do, you're going to eat it with a false imprisonment suit. Don't touch them. Don't make any promises about immunity. Don't lie to them. Okay, you can't tell them what's going to happen. All you can do is just gather the facts, and don't promise anonymity. Okay, you're not always talking to the suspect, right? Sometimes you're just talking about the people that know things about the case. Sometimes people know things, but they want to stay out of it, and they'll say, well, you know, I don't want my name used. And I want you to promise me that if I tell you things that you're not going to use my name, and you can't make that. You can't do that. Okay? You can't do anonymity. Now, if it's a real critical issue, yeah, you get with the lawyers, and you know, you let the lawyers solve it. But yeah, that's above your pay grade. You cannot grant immunity, and you cannot promise anonymity. In general, read the material carefully in your textbook. I don't read everything, but obviously some things you really focus on. Focus on the material about interviews, because there are a bunch of CFE exam questions that relate to interviews. And they're pretty easy questions, and you want to get them all. Okay, a little planning here. Next week is September 20th. And the following week is September 27th. Send, recalendar. Next week, our subject is employee fraud and the net worth method of estimating income. Okay? We'll not meet, and really I should change the thing. We're not going to meet, period. It says here at UCD. Actually, we're just not going to meet. There'll be a video that's posted on our eCollege page that I'm going to record later this afternoon. Notes are discussed that are discussed in the video or posted in doc sharing. Now, there's 2 typos on this page. I hate that. When the video and notes are posted, I'll send you an email. Okay? Immediately after we get out of this class, which we're fixing to do, okay, I'm going to take a short break, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do it again for material for the following week for September 27th. Okay? The following week is our first test, and that's what I'm a little bit uncomfortable about. We meet today, right? And then we meet, next week we're going to meet in this manner, which means we're not actually in touch. And then the following week is your test. Okay? Basically, we will meet on the Wednesday after September 27th, October something. I'm guessing October 4. I'm not sure today, but we'll meet on that third Wednesday, and then your test will open up at 11:59 that night, and it'll stay open until 11:59 on the following Saturday, and in class on that that Wednesday, yeah, I'll give you some clues about what's going to be on the test. In any event, look in doc sharing for a video or class that's been recorded that takes the place of the class that we would normally have had next Wednesday, September 27th. Okay, the following week, we'll come in and we'll have some questions to answer on a test. Okay, Miss Lou, Miss Thomas, do you have? Okay, and if you would, Ms. Lou, send me an email about this homework question. If there's an error on the key, I need to know about it, and I appreciate it, and I'll try to go look at it. I've got to go to Dallas this afternoon, and by the time I finish this other class, I may not have enough time to do it today, but Ms. Lou, please do send me an email about that so I can get it fixed. For people that haven't done this yet, and for them that have, I can go back and make changes that might be required on the key. Thank you for your keen eye and good edits, okay? Ms. Thomas, thank you for being here too. We'll see you again 2 weeks from today when we talk about questions that are going to be on our first test, and some of you I may see in about 15 minutes when we do our class that takes the place of the one to be next Thursday. Thank you for being here, and goodbye.